Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, the podcast where we talk about religion, popular culture, and everything in between. I'm Ale Thomas, and I am joined, as ever, by Vivian Asimos. How are you, Vivian?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm keeping well. It's nice and warm today.
Oh, it's
The
very
weather's nice.
warm.
Yeah, it's good. We've had a bit of miserable weather of late, haven't we? I
I
think
have a
we're
fan set up next to my desk, which is currently off because of the recording, but as
of
soon
course.
as we are finished with this, it is going back on.
Mm. And that's coming from a Floridian.
Well, I moved here for a reason.
Exactly, you didn't sign up for this, did you?
No.
Didn't sign up
I
for
hate
a
it.
burning, planet. Anyway, on
On that
putting
happy note.
putting the climate crisis to one side, um, this week we are discussing comedy. Funnily enough, something a little bit happier, or rather, perhaps happier. Comedy is a very subjective issue, and we're obviously going to be discussing comedy in relation to religion and popular culture. Comedy is, of course, a very prominent part of pop culture. It isn't limited to, say, a sitcom, for example. You can have satire, stand-up comedians. There's all sorts of things that are comedic, with the intention of making one laugh. Um, Comedy is something that appeals to certain types of audiences. So you've got different comedies for different audiences. What an individual finds funny can be different to what another individual finds funny. A lot of it can also come down to as well what the butt of the joke is. So I don't know about you, Vivian, but I like comedy that punches up
Yes.
and doesn't punch down. Good comedy should always aim at targeting people in positions of power, not um, people in minority statuses that often do get picked out in certain types of comedies. Um, so, something that is important to remember in the discussion of religion and comedy is the idea of offense. I think that a lot of discourse surrounding religion and comedy involves the idea of someone being offended by something, or the idea that religion is a something that is uh, too special, for want of a better term, to be involved with comedy. That it's a deeply personal aspect of one's life, and therefore should be beyond the remit
Yeah.
of
Too
comedy.
serious.
Too serious, too important, too ineffable.
Ooh.
Um, I know, right? Um, I know that of late, Stephen Gregg has been doing work on religion and comedy, and particularly the special status that religion is given in society. That religion is often treated as a characteristic or an aspect of society that is special, and therefore is a contested category when it comes to comedy. I think he's actually putting a book together at the moment on religion and humor, which should be quite interesting. So go and check that out, everyone. But what I thought we could do today is discuss a few examples of religion and comedy. What makes them interesting? What do they tell us about religion and comedy? How religions respond to it? And I was thinking of dividing it into a couple of categories. I wanted to first talk about general religion and comedy, in TV shows or in Broadway shows, cartoons, and so on. And then I wanted us to quickly discuss at the end stand up comedy, because I think there's a very interesting relationship and dynamic between stand up comedy and the process of secularization,
Mm.
which I'll get to in a bit. So, how well? Let's just talk comedy for a moment. What about you, Vivian? What do you like comedy? What sort of comedy do you like?
I do like comedy. I like a good laugh. I think, like you say, I think punching up tends to be where I find the better humor. So finding humor in people kind of punching at the establishment, at the man.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I came a lot more to realize that when Brooklyn Nine-Nine came out. Because
Yes.
Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a very good example of almost always, they don't always, but almost always punching up rather than down, and still being really funny. Because I think a lot
Yeah.
of people think that it's you can't be funny unless you're punching down. I am of the opinion that a racist joke is still racist. It's in the descriptor.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So it's not really always where I go to. I have also found a lot of humor, to no surprise to probably a lot of people who listen to a lot of what I do, in reality television.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of the way they do comedy in reality television is really fascinating because it's all in the editing. It's in the way that they put together scenes to make a point without actually having to say anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, you'll have somebody, say a real housewife, say something about how smart they are, and then it'll quickly go to a clip of them doing something really stupid. And they don't need to say anything, they don't need to
Mm-hmm.
do anything, but just in that kind of quick, those comparison, that juxtaposition, that you go, I get the joke.
Yeah.
I know what you're doing and how you're doing it, and it's funny. And I laugh quite a lot at
Mm-hmm.
the editing of particularly Bravo shows and Real Housewives. They definitely have some stellar editors.
Yes, good editing is key, isn't it? Because ask me what the secret to comedy is.
What is the secret to
Timing.
comedy?
Sorry, that's a Mark Commode joke. Or at the very least, I've heard Mark Commode say it. Um, yeah, absolutely. Editing is really good. It probably won't surprise people to know that I'm a big fan of left wing comedy. I really like stuff like Frankie Boyle's New World Order, which very much punches up at established elites. There's been a lot of conversation recently about getting right wing comedy on television. But I think a big problem with right wing comedy is that frankly it just isn't funny. Leaving right wing rhetoric to one side for a moment, it just isn't funny. If they want to get right wing comedians on TV, then they need to start being funny. Um, but yeah, so I like comedy that challenges elite narratives
Mm.
and does so in a very cutting way. Like I like well edited shows as well. I like stuff like Archer. I don't know if you watch Archer.
I've seen a couple of episodes.
It's very tightly written, and the way the scenes are spliced into each other, linked by dialogue, is really cleverly done. I think Archer's actually quite underrated in terms of how it's written. Um, so yeah, that's that's my sort of humor. But well, how do you feel about mean spirited comedy
Yeah, I
from
mean, I
doing
think
editing?
that's kind of tied to what I was saying, but I think, you know, it's a very common trope of people when they say something, and I'm sure we'll get into it in more depth when we talk about offense, but when they say something offensive and they go, oh, well, it was just a joke.
Mm, yeah.
And I think it's really important to keep in mind that homophobic jokes, racist jokes, sexist jokes are still racist, sexist, homophobic.
Mm,
That they carry the same rhetoric, they carry the same narratives, and they carry the same sentiment, and they tend to continue to uphold those systems of oppression.
yes.
Even if you don't agree with them, if you are sharing those jokes, you are essentially agreeing with them by allowing that joke to stand. So I tend to not find it funny. It tends to just be, to me, I just hear it as being offensive and
Mm,
hurtful for no necessary reason. So
yes.
I think that I tend to prefer, therefore, ones that, as we said, punch up, ones that don't make a target of their joke other than the system, for lack of a better word, if there is to be a target. And that's why I kind of don't mind the ones on like reality TV, even though they are targeting the individuals who are obviously real people. But those are people who are putting themselves on display to be targets. They know that that's part of the gig. To be honest, actually, Bravo and Real Housewives are known to be the ones that treat their their cast, much better than a lot of other reality shows because they need to keep them on board. So something like, this is getting into the depths of reality television, but something like, say, The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, you go on it and then you pretty much immediately get off of it. And so you can therefore kind of treat these people however you want in the editing. You can treat them however you need to, and if they don't like it, it doesn't matter because they're not going to stick around. Yeah. But with Real Housewives, they need to stick around. You need them to come back season after season after season because that's what makes the show. Mm-hmm. And so you can't treat them very poorly. The Kardashians have this as well. The Kardashians actually had say in the way that things were edited. They could watch it and have a pass at the editing of saying, oh, I want that removed. I want this kept in, that kind of a thing. Because, again, you need them on board. You need them to stick around. And, of course, there's been really shady editing in Kardashians, despite the fact that they have a pass at the edit. So because, again, they know what they're doing. They know what they signed up for. They know that they are part of the joke. It's when people don't sign up to be part of the joke, who then become targets of it, that I find a bit questionable. And I think those ethics tend to make it, therefore, not as funny to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that slides nicely into one of the examples I wanted to discuss. I wanted to discuss the work of Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park. Because they've got a dual aspect when it comes to this conversation. On the one hand, they make comedy, and on the other hand, they also make satire. So it's something important to consider with regards to religion and comedy, because religion is often seen in comedy as something elite. It's often seen from the perspective of establishment. So a lot of how religion is understood in comedy isn't in terms of everyday lived realities, but rather in terms of an established organization such as the Roman Catholic Church, for example, something typically quite wealthy and powerful.
Yeah, I think religion is a weird one because it is either the establishment, the system, the thing to punch up at, and be fine, essentially. Or it's such a minority, because it's not one of the establishment, that it becomes a minority fringe group that you therefore aren't targeting a large percentage of. So it's easy to make fun of, some weird fringe religious group or religious ideology because that's the minority. Or you're punching at the system. And so I think either way, it becomes a very... I don't want to say an easy target, but it's kind of an easy target. Yeah, absolutely. And you see that particularly with their show South Park, which they position themselves in that show as equal opportunity offenders. So no one's safe, but part of the comedy is that it's quite... what's the term I'm looking for? It's quite unapologetic. It's intentionally offensive. Yeah. And it's shock humor. That's the term I'm looking for. In that you're laughing at how surprisingly shocking the comedy is, and they turn their attention to religion a lot on those grounds. And again, it's that very much an idea of religion being this organized elite group based on archaic beliefs and practices. Have you seen any South Park, Vivian? I have. I used to watch it quite a bit when I was younger. It's been a while since I have seen it.
Yeah, I've not seen it in a while.
But I remember that they treated different religious groups quite differently. So obviously, Scientology is a huge target for
Yes.
South Park, and I think those writers in particular. Scientology is a big one to completely punch the fuck out of. You know, they don't mind taking shots. But then when they treat something like Mormonism, there's still a couple of shots taken, but it's still treated as something positive still. They kind of
Yeah.
have a certain level of respect for Mormonism that they just don't have for Scientology.
Yes, they treat Scientology with utter contempt.
Yeah.
And it's not even positioned as, Mormonism is still positioned as a religion, and we'll get to the Book of Mormon in a moment.
Yeah.
But in the well, they actually did 2 episodes about Scientology. In the first one, it's not even positioned as a religion. It's a scam. It's a business scam, is what they say, and it's revealed to the characters at the end that it's just a money making pyramid scheme. Because there's this really interesting perception in popular culture and in wider discourse that a religion can't be something based on profit, which I find really fascinating because we live in this neoliberal capitalist society where everything is based on this so-called free market. But when a religion starts doing it, people lose their minds. For the record, all religions are involved with money one way or another because they have to be. But that tends to be the target that they take with Scientology, is based on that financial aspect. So yeah, their depiction of Scientology was very scathing. But I find very interesting about their show as well is that they were interviewed once about being atheist comedians, and it struck them that this interviewer assumed that they were atheist because they were making fun of every religion that came their way. So as a response, they decided to make a 2-part episode about new atheism. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I was about to say I've seen an episode where they essentially take shots at atheism. And I think at the end, the whole idea was they jumped ahead to the future, and the 2 science groups were fighting each other over essentially the same things that like religion has wars over, of, I believe in this part of the algorithm as being different than that part of the algorithm, and they were having wars over it. And so the point,
"Oh my science" instead of "oh my god."
Yeah, it was the point that they were trying to make was that these versions of atheism are essentially religions in and of themselves, which is something that I think a lot of atheists might really not like and take offense to, in the same way that they would for if they were of the religious groups that they were kind of taking shots at. And so there is a certain amount of even-handedness, but they're not always even-handed because, like we said, they do treat certain religions differently than other ones. And I think the way they treated, those atheistic debates versus the way they treat Scientology versus the way they treat Mormonism are 3 very different ways of treating it.
Yeah, indeed. And it's the Scientology one was particularly interesting because the Isaac Hayes, who played Chef, was a Scientologist, and he quit the show because of this episode. And so they ended up making a follow-up episode based on they ended up sorry that just totally lost my thread there. They ended up making a follow-up episode based on Hayes's departure, and when he left, I've actually got it up on screen. Hayes, when he quit the show, said, "There is a place in this world for satire, but there is a time when satire ends and intolerance and bigotry towards religious beliefs in others begins. Religious beliefs are sacred to people, and at all times they should be respected and honoured. As a civil rights activist of the past 40 years, I cannot support a show that disrespects those beliefs and practices." However, when they responded to Hayes's departure, Stone said, this is 100% having to do with his faith of Scientology. He has no problem, and he's cashed plenty of checks with our show making fun of Christians. They added that they had not heard a peep out of Isaac in any way until we did Scientology. He wants a different standards for religions other than his own, and to me, that is where intolerance and bigotry begins. So it's an interesting conversation, isn't it? Because clearly, for Isaac Hayes, he felt that they had punched down at his religion in Scientology, but their counter argument is that they had made fun of several other religions beforehand, and that he didn't object until that point. After Hayes departed, they obviously had to decide what to do about Chef, who was a very popular South Park character at the time, and they killed him off. And the way have you seen how they killed him off?
I don't remember.
They get him to join a cult group, essentially, cult in inverted commas, and he ends up dying as they try to as he tries to escape. And there's a moment at the end at Chef's funeral where one of the characters, where this is essentially the creators speaking through the characters, saying, we're all disappointed with what's happened with Chef of late, but we can't blame him. It's not his fault. It's that creepy cult screwing up his brain. So, and that's a clear jab at Scientology with that cultic rhetoric. There are actually 2 episodes in that size. So I think that's an interesting example in that it raises our question of offence and who it's okay to offend and who it isn't okay to offend. And they certainly clearly went out of their way to upset the Scientology audience. But they also have had success of late with the Book of Mormon musical. Have you seen Book of Mormon, Vivian?
I have seen Book of Mormon. I saw Book of Mormon in London, I think, which was very exciting.
Book of Mormon is excellent. So for those who don't know, it follows 2 young Mormons spreading the work of Joseph Smith, and they end up in, I think it's Uganda, isn't it?
Yeah, so every in Mormonism, when you reach a certain age and you are a man, but I think they have also started doing it with women more lately, that you get sent off on a missionary expedition for 2 years, and then you come back. And so everyone does it for at least 2 years. So this is following 2 Mormons. They always get paired up, and they're going off on their mission trip for their 2 years. And so they get sent off to Uganda. And I think they're the only ones that get sent off to some really far away place like that. Everyone else was like Orlando and Tampa.
Everybody gets all these touristy destinations.
Yeah.
And they send their prize missionary out to Uganda on the grounds that he's really good at what he does, but he's also very superficial in the sense that he thinks he's so great he should be allowed to go to Orlando so that he can spend time in Disney.
Yeah.
And they pair him with the most inept member of the group, again presumably thinking that he can help raise this chap to a better standard. So Book of Mormon's really interesting for a number of reasons. First one is, if we're talking about religion and comedy, they're the most offensive, if we're going to discuss that side. Aspect is that there's a song called Hasadiga Ibawai, which is essentially a play on, what's it called? The song from Lion King.
Yeah, the Circle of Life type.
The one that Timon and Pumbaa sing.
Oh, Hakuna Matata.
Yeah, because Hakuna Matata means no worries, and Hasadiga Ibawai means fuck you, God. And the play of the song is that you don't realise until the end that that's what it means. So they're getting the Mormons to sing along with it. But the song is all about the problem of evil, and that that philosophical idea of the problem of evil. Why would a just and loving God allow humanity to suffer? And they're reeling off all the terrible things that are happening to them, and therefore they're cursing God because they have to live through it. So this becomes a theme then for the rest of the show, because the lead character in particular struggles with his faith, because he has such a hard time of it, that eventually they come to the conclusion at the end of the musical that it doesn't matter what they believe, it's about the sense of belonging.
Yeah,
Um,
and they also talk about because obviously Mormonism, one of the biggest jokes that people generally have with Mormonism is the kind of what seems like strange out there stories from them. And of course, I have the opinion that they're not as strange as literally any other religion's stories
no,
go.
no, not at all.
But people perceive them as very strange. And so the in the play, they also talk about how these stories are just stories and they're meant to just kind of help you through things, and that it's about the belonging and it's about helping you through hard times, and it's really not about all of these other things. So it's this really positive outcome and discussion about religion generally speaking, and about Mormonism specifically, and these kind of positive views of Mormonism. Although there's a really funny moment where one of the characters goes, Salt Lake City isn't a real place.
It's a metaphor. Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the characters gets berated by the church a lot because he spins aspects of the church's teaching. He
Yeah.
puts little lies in, usually with pop culture references, and he is the one who is successful in converting them because he fills Mormonism with all these pop culture references about Darth Vader and so on. But it seems to resonate with the community, and eventually it doesn't matter that their society is improved by this shared belonging. That's really interesting, and yeah, of course, they do really mock the beliefs of Mormonism, like you were saying, presented as being something that's very out there and different, even though it's not particularly compared to most other religions. And I'd say that's the same with the way they present Scientology as well. As I think
Yeah.
people need to take a step back from their own cultural backgrounds at times and really consider how everything is unusual if you're not familiar with it. Um, so I remember reading that the Book of Mormon was described as a love letter to Mormonism from atheists.
Mm.
So it's still taking those jabs, but it's doing it with a slightly tongue in cheek vibe, a little, a wink and a nod.
Yeah.
And it interested me when I saw it because, of course, when I saw it, I'd already started my PhD, so I was well into studying Scientology, and I'd seen the South Park Scientology episode years ago, but I thought there was a big contrast between how they were presenting two new religious movements. I know whether Mormonism now counts as a new religion is up for debate, but let's put that to one side. They do take two new religions and they present them in very different light for
Yeah, and
very
I mean they
different
do
reasons.
that in South Park as well. Like, so there's I think one or two Mormon families in the town of South Park who are very infrequently shown, but when they are, the joke about them is that they're very normal compared to everyone else. So they were like, the kids were going to go out and do whatever crazy thing that the episode was about. And the Mormon family was like, "Oh no, we're just gonna go home and play board games together. It's Saturday. That's what we
and
do."
they're happy.
They're the happy, well-adjusted, perfectly
Yeah.
normal children, and everyone else are these crazy, really terrible, unhappy people. And so like even in South Park, they always portrayed Mormons as happy, well-adjusted, very, very good, very family-oriented, like all these really positive things. But that was the joke. And so again, that's
Yeah.
kind of a very strange punching up of making them, the joke is that they're great rather than them being really terrible and weird and in your words culty, some not your words, but you know what I mean, like the
How very
using
dare
that
you.
kind of phrasing of culte
Yeah, absolutely.
which I think a lot of people do see Mormonism as, and the way that they portrayed it as a very positive thing was actually really cool. And the Book of Mormon was, for the most part, I think, embraced by the Church of Latter-day Saints and Mormons. When I went in my little program, there were loads of ads for the Church of Latter-day Saints, and they had like, oh, you've heard the music, now you can read the book. And
the book is always better.
Yeah, trying to like recruit people through these jokes about, now come and learn about the real thing. And I think there was another one that I heard. One of my friends went to go see it in Florida when I still lived there. And they said that there was a bunch of Mormons outside, and at first they thought they were like picketing it, but they were just out there to try to like be like, hey, come join.
Yeah.
And it's
been
very,
a very clever marketing technique.
Yeah, and so I think there's this like, I don't think Scientology would react that way. No. And granted, I don't know if they would react that way because they just wouldn't be given a very positive viewpoint in the same way.
Oh yes, yeah.
But I think if they were, I don't know if they would still embrace it. It's a very complicated one to know because I don't think they've really been frequently put in a position of positive views.
Yeah, certainly not in pop culture. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a very interesting piece of marketing, essentially, on the Church of Latter-day Saints' part. That they have taken advantage of that, and they've also positioned it as we can take a bit of a joke.
Yeah.
And that's okay, and that seems to go down well with people. The fact that they do advertise the literal Book of Mormon in the Book of Mormon program and stuff is generally seen as quite amusing, and people say, oh, good on them for acknowledging the play and having fun with it in that sense as well. Something I find really interesting about Book of Mormon is it's one of our favourites. So we saw it in London, and then while we were on honeymoon, we saw it in New York. And the audience reaction to different jokes was very interesting.
Yeah?
Yeah. The British audience were far more ready to laugh at the offensive, shall we say, parts. Whereas the American audience were a little more reserved during, say, Hasadiga Ibawai. And certain... I just thought it was really interesting because obviously you are seeing two different cultures respond to the exact same performance.
Yeah.
There was a lot more laughter coming from the British audience. I'm not really I don't really have any conclusions to draw from that. It's just something that I found quite interesting.
No, that is. I only saw it once in London, so I have but I saw it with my uncle and my mother, who are obviously both American. But my uncle's been living in the UK now for quite some time. And I remember during that one of looking over, and my mom was laughing but looking like maybe she shouldn't be. But my uncle was just cracking up. But as I said, my uncle's been here for a more substantial amount of time, and he's also got a very complicated relationship with religion in general. So, it is interesting, I think, to have that, because I do think of Britain as being much more religious, but in a quieter sense.
Yes. Yeah.
I think America has that, like, in that, you know how when people kind of constantly talk about how they're smart and it makes you think that they're not smart? I think America has that with religion sometimes, where they're so upfront about it all the time, where you just go, are you just like compensating for something? While with Britain, that you don't talk about it a lot, but it's so embedded in the culture and it's so present everywhere that it's very difficult to untangle it in a way that I don't think is quite the same in America. But that's probably a whole different discussion for another time. But
yeah, no, that is really interesting, because a lot of those reactions essentially come down to how we treat religion in comedic spaces.
Yeah.
And how we treat religion as an object of satire. So I don't know. From my own experience, I tend to find that British satire tends to be a lot more cutting than American satire. Or do you disagree?
I think it depends on what it's towards. You know, like America was kind of the one that started the Daily Show, for instance,
Mm,
which is much more cutting from a political standpoint. And that's what really started things like the Colbert Report and now the Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. You know, those things are piggybacking off of
yeah, yeah, of
the
course.
Daily Show. But that didn't frequently target religion. That was targeting politicians, which obviously they use religion, but I think that people can get behind making fun of politicians who use religion as a weapon. There's a really, I think it's very well known now, of AOC yelling at, well, not really yelling, but she was getting very mad at people using religion to make a political point or to prohibit things like access to healthcare for, you know, blacks and for access to abortion and things like that. And she has a go at it of saying, you know, I'm Christian and I hate seeing my religion being used in this way.
Hmm.
So I think it's very different when because in that sense you're almost defending religion through the humor,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which I guess is kind of what's happening with Mormonism.
Mm,
Is they're essentially defending Mormonism through their satire and their humor.
yeah.
Parker and Stone, obviously.
Yes, yes, of course.
That I don't think gets extended everywhere.
Mm,
But I think what's fascinating is that a lot of their arguments, like the point of the show for Book of Mormon, you can extend to all of religion, including Scientology.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
It's a point about religion.
yeah, but the fact that they don't give it the same grace, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And to shift the focus for a moment, a big conversation around offense and religion is with regards to depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in critiques of Islam. I'm thinking particularly the Charlie Hebdo comics, which were obviously quite famous for their cartoons of Muhammad that was obviously then implicated in the tragic terrorist attack as well. But outlets like Charlie Hebdo will say that it's on the grounds of free speech, and that similar to the argument that Parker and Stone made when Isaac Hayes quit South Park, in that we mock other religions, we should offend everyone equally, for want of a better term. And then it becomes a very contested issue, doesn't it? Because Muslims are victims of prejudice in so many Western societies that a lot of the jokes surrounding say a depiction of Muhammad or so forth does tie in with what you were mentioning earlier at the beginning of this conversation. Sometimes jokes can be adapted for racist means.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that Charlie Hebdo's comics are racist. I'm not saying I'm pro or against them. But what I am saying is that jokes that are aimed at a minority group, even if they aren't intended to be used in a prejudiced manner, can still be adapted by certain groups. And that's part of it's the challenge of when a comedian or someone who does satire puts something out into the world. People can then do what they want with it.
Yeah.
So things like comedic depictions of religion can be used by far right groups, for example, even if the creator of that satire would in no way endorse their ideology. So it's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a certain level of, I mean, personally, I think there's a certain level of being able to joke about certain stuff without crossing a certain line. And I think there are plenty of jokes you could probably make about Islam that don't involve depicting a prophet that they say not to depict. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is lazy.
yeah, and I think
It,
there's a certain level of to it of if the point is to simply make a satire that isn't hateful, then there's plenty of ways to go about doing that, right? And I think that it makes the question of intent raised, I think, when it goes to that level, when it crosses that. And we can obviously use it for the Prophet Muhammad because it's easier to kind of pinpoint these instances, or it's a very obvious line that I think a lot of people are aware of. But I think every group has these lines. They're just slightly different depending on the group and what they look like and what their beliefs are. And I think there's ways to make jokes without crossing each of those lines. And it takes, I think, a lot of religious literacy as well as social literacy to understand where those lines are and why they are there.
yes, I agree.
Which becomes very complicated, and why religious studies should stay in school.
Absolutely. And this is another nice segue as well to the last thing that I wanted to discuss. Religious literacy in terms of stand-up comedy. I think that there's an interesting relationship between modern stand-up comedy and the process of secularization. And for the sake of brevity, let's consider secularization to be the rise of the scientific method, cause and effect, rationality, and the perceived decline of religious engagement, which is usually equated with declining church numbers, not necessarily whether people are doing religion on the ground.
Yeah, that's it. That's a whole nother discussion, I think.
It is, yes. But I think that this understanding of secularization has filtered into a lot of modern stand-up comedy, where the jokes about religion, may not even be necessarily aimed at the institutional elites that we referred to earlier on in this conversation. They're actually purely about religion as belief, where they're presented as irrational as at best and dangerous at worst. There's a whole Ricky Gervais stand-up routine where he essentially just reads from the Bible, and the laughter is, about how absurd what he's reading from the Bible is. And it's all about religion as belief and how it's completely irrational, not in keeping with the scientific method. And this sort of stand-up seems to have coincided with the emergence of new atheism, particularly the so-called Four Horsemen of the new atheism, which I can't say with a straight face.
Stupidest name.
Yeah. In fact, there's conversations on YouTube between Gervais and Dawkins. So Gervais has really placed himself in this atheist branch because he'd read a science book once, and now he thinks he's Carl Sagan.
I can tell you don't like Ricky Gervais.
Yes and no. A lot of his stuff I do like. I really like The Office. I've laughed at a lot of his stuff. At the same time, I think his religious literacy is incredibly poor.
Yeah, I was about to say, does that mean that you actually... Because I found that I think, after much research, and by research I just mean lots of different videos on YouTube and stuff, I think what I've learned is that I think Stephen Merchant is funny, and not Ricky Gervais.
Yes, yes, I agree with that too. Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of Ricky Gervais's stand-up is based on that shock humor that we mentioned earlier, and that the
Yeah.
idea that if you've offended someone, then it's automatically funny. They can't take the joke. Um, and that's certainly what happens with the religion side. So I think so much of stand-up comedy doesn't treat religion as a series of practices, or an everyday experience, or even an institutional aspect of society. It's about the belief and the irrationality of it, and I think Gervais is at the forefront of that type of stand-up comedy.
Yeah, and it's a complicated thing because I mean, we could have, I think, a whole series of podcast episodes where we just talk about the concept of belief because that's,
Mm.
I mean, a huge, huge rabbit hole to go down. But I think I have of the opinion that belief is always far more complicated than people give it credit for.
Mm.
And I have written it somewhere before. It's probably in my book, Digital Monsters, by now. But it's, I think I've written it before where I see belief as kind of like being at like a public swimming pool. So
Mm-hmm.
you've got people who are, deep in the deep end and completely submerged. But you've also got people that are like hanging out in the shallow end where they're like in the water, but they're not like
Yeah.
fully immersed yet. And then you got people sticking their feet in. And then you got other people who are like at the pool and they're walking around, but they're not in the water. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I think people tend to think of belief as either you're in the deep end or you're not. You're not
Mm-hmm.
even there. And belief is far more complicated than that. And I think that's something that it's obviously not a funny conversation, which is which is why it's a lot more complicated for comedy. I think comedy likes to have things more simple because it makes it easier to digest and therefore make fun of.
Mm-hmm.
But belief is inherently, I think, a lot more complicated than that. And religion is far more complicated than just the complicated notion of belief. So you have all sorts of complicated ideas being piled onto something in reality, but that makes it really difficult to talk about. It makes it really difficult to make a joke about because it's complicated and it's really, I mean, if you look at how, things like Last Week Tonight can spend a really long time to make a joke about a very particular aspect of a very particular type of politics.
Mm.
It's like that. Where I think that in order to do it accurately, you'd have to have an entire show that like fully breaks down complicated ideas, makes them easier to understand, and then makes the joke at the end.
Yeah, yeah.
And that just doesn't make good stand-up comedy or TV show.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah, so it's an interesting one, isn't it? And you can see throughout these examples that we've discussed that there's very much a idea of what religion is,
Yeah.
and it certainly comes down to what you were describing as people are either in or out. There are no breaking down of binaries in terms of insiders and outsiders, which I know we love to do. Um, but and I think there's a very simplistic understanding of religion, particularly in stand-up comedy.
I remember completely blowing a student's mind when he had written down on we had like response sheets and stuff that they had to do every week, which was annoying for me, but it was actually kind of fun because I got to see all of their thought processes. They had to write like a 1-page response to their reading. And he had written that he basically that there's no such thing as people who are of multiple religions, that you are either of a religion or you're not of a religion, you're of a different religion, kind of a thing. And I blew this kid's mind when I told him that actually there are people who adhere to more than one religious belief, and that it's
Mm.
possible and that you can and it's fully okay, and that people do it all the time and there are huge amounts of those people. But this idea that I think the idea that you are either Christian or you are something else or you are nothing else, and there is
Mm.
no other, you know, connect. You can't be Christian and Buddhist. And it's like, well, actually, when you look at them, you can. And there is nothing prohibiting you from doing that.
Absolutely.
And those aren't the only two. Like, you can be of multiple things, and that's fine. And it makes sense. And it's completely normal as well. And that's what makes things really complicated. And that's where you can really see that it's not an all in or an all out. And I just remember having that kid just be like, what are you talking about, when I started explaining it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget when it comes to religion that people are dynamic and creative, and that is what results in these fluid binaries.
Yeah.
That people do innovate, they do change their minds. Humans are independent thinkers, and religion is a result of that. And a lot of it comes down to that sui generis model of religion that so many people subscribe to, that religion is this aspect of society that exists on its own, that it is what it is. But it's actually the result of human processes and human interactions. And so it's interesting to see that play out on a comedic stage. So, Vivian, if people want to talk to you about what you find funny and the dynamic nature of religion, where can they find you?
You can follow me on most social media platforms at Vivian Asimos, primarily Twitter and Instagram. I'm getting into TikTok. I'm not going to announce my account yet because I'm not doing anything yet, but stay tuned.
You're preparing a dance routine in your bedroom.
I might, I don't know, maybe I'll have conversations about religion on TikTok. That'll be big, right?
Yeah.
People will like that.
Yeah, they'll all be subscribing in their thousands, I have no doubt.
You can also go to my website, incidentalmythology.com, where I talk about a lot of mythology and popular culture. So if you like that, go there. And Alan, where can people laugh at you?
Oh, people can laugh at me on Twitter at AlaJLL Thomas, and I'm very good humoured. So come and have some fun with me on the Twitter sphere. That would be great. And do we know what we're discussing next time, Vivian, or is it?
I don't know if we do.
So that'll be a surprise for you all.
We are recording these a little bit in advance because Alan is taking a well-deserved couple weeks off from recordings.
Yes.
So we're recording a couple of episodes in a row of things.
Indeed.
So that way,
so we're ahead of schedule, which is nice.
Yeah, which means that I have several weeks before I have to think about what our next episode is.
Well, you should take time off as well, Vivian.
We'll see.
No, you definitely should. So
I don't know when this is coming out because of all of that, but if it is before, I think it'll be before September. It should be. Yes. We have a lovely event coming up where Alan is going to be talking about Free Zone Scientology. So if you want to know more about it. So I may be discussing
some of the issues that we discussed today in relation to Scientology in a bit more depth.
Yeah, so if you wanted to know more about Scientology and what the hell Free Zone Scientology is, then come on down. Yes, you can check it out. All of the information is on altac.uk's website, which is alt-ac.uk. There's a little talks form, and there's you can also check out the other talks that we have coming up. But the very first one is Alan's, and I'll be moderating that one. So if you want to see both of our lovely faces, you can go on there and check that out.
Absolutely. Excellent.
So, yeah. So, Alan, I hope you have a nice break.
Thank you, Vivian, and I hope you take a break too.
And of course, there won't be any break for our listeners, but
No. No break for you, lot. You will listen to our podcast and enjoy it.
I am sure our next episode will be just as interesting and full of religion and pop culture and everything in between.
Very good.
Bye.
Bye, folks. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Religion and Popular Pop.
The pop. I swear you're doing these on purpose now because you know I put them at the end of the
Yeah.
episode.
Oh, you do you?
I do.
Oh, I thought you've been editing them.